Welcome to your mastery tips and tricks here. We are ready to inspire, educate, and serve, and we're always bringing you special guests. So thank you so much, Suzanne, for being on the show with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm so grateful to share with you guys a little bit more about Suzanne and what we're going to be talking about today. So, today is all about how to own your grief and emotions. And I was really excited to bring Suzanne on the show today because she's a grief educator. And I think this is something that we need to bring to the forefront is our emotional intelligence and understanding that grief is a process and we want to help it start to become common and part of the conversations. And there's different types and times in our lives that this comes into
Mhm.
play. And so I'm so excited about the conversation we're going to have today.
Me too.
Yay! And so first, I'll give you guys a little bit more information. Suzanne is a grieving mom who shares her story to help others learn about grief and how to support each other in it. She is a certified grief educator, transformational coach, and workshop leader who is passionate about opening conversations about grief. She's determined to normalize grief and sees this universal experience as an opportunity to deepen relationships and bridge divides. So thank you so much for being on the show. And first, share a little bit about your journey and how you started as a grief educator.
Thank you. I started as a grief educator out of my most recent loss, which was the death of my son in 2020. He was 22, and I realized there was something about that out of order loss that really was grief on the next level. Grief to the 10th degree compared to other losses that I had had. And I realized also very quickly that I was going to have to be two things. I was going to have to be conscious and curious
Mm.
as a means of survival. It sounds very lofty, but it really was about survival. So conscious meant that I had to look all the emotions in the face and let them be all right and not deny any of it, because I knew if I went unconscious in any way and just tried to sort of stuff it in a box, that was not going to work. And the curious really was about, if I didn't want to hear any of the stories that we hear about parents who've lost a child, which all are that they never get their life back and they just become husks. Like, they're all terrible and they're all not true. But if not that, then what? And really, in the
Mm.
earliest days, the curiosity was about, how do we get through a day? How do we just survive today? And then the curiosity really became about, how does grief work? And how, what are the symptoms that you have that no one tells you about because we don't talk about it? But if we talked about it, would not be so scary, would not be so isolating. So that really became my purpose and my way to just make sense of, this horrible thing had happened and I wasn't going to let it be for nothing. So this was a way that I could use what I was learning and what I was experiencing, what I was finding out, and start to open those conversations and start to share it with people. And the feedback I got right from the very beginning was that, people had never had anyone in their life they could talk about grief with, that they didn't really understand how it worked. They were scared. There's a lot of fear around grief for everyone involved, right? For the griever and the people who are supporting them. So the curiosity then expanded to, as I got to the point where my own survival was no longer in question, right? Became about, how does this really work? And how can we change it? Because the way that it works now is really terrible for everybody. And I don't think it needs to be that way. So that really has become my driving purpose, is how, what are actionable, simple, if not easy, things that we can all do to help this not be such a stigma, such a taboo topic, so isolating for everyone involved. So that's how I got here.
Well, I'm so glad that you are, and thank you so much for sharing your story and giving your experience meaning and purpose and going forward.
Mhm.
It is really important. Grief is something that isn't talked about, and yet death is guaranteed.
Yeah.
And yet we're not taught how to deal with it. So I know when I dealt with one of the first deaths in my life, I was 13 and I know I did not deal well at all. So in university, I had an opportunity and I took an elective and it was called death and bereavement. And it was a
Mm.
super intense course. Nobody, I thought I was taking a bird course.
Right?
So
This
there
was
was
your
like,
easy credit. Yeah, you should have looked for macrame, but you did it.
joke was on me because there was 3 books we had to read, and we had to
Oh no.
study how each culture
Yeah.
dealt with death and grief. And what I realized is that almost all cultures have a series of things that they do. And we've talked about this before, like Greek Orthodox, a year later does a celebration of life and allows everybody to come together, share their experience, how they've been grieving, share their favorite memories. And yet
Mhm.
somehow here in North America, we're meant to just pretend it didn't happen and move along. And so that needs to
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah.
And we also need to understand and that there's different areas of grief. We're talking about the grief of losing our old self, old lives, right?
Mhm.
Everybody is grieving the loss of their old life over the last few years. We all have created new norms and new realities and new perceptions. And there's lots of, and perhaps we've changed our circles. And so there's some
Mhm.
grief, a loss of old friends that we realize are no longer in alignment, so on and so forth. So we actually know that this grief is not just the death of a person, but it's loss.
Yeah.
And so it actually relates in a lot of different areas of life. And I know that you've got some great tips to share with us today on how to manage that and how to manage our emotions and build that emotional intelligence that allows us to process the grief, where most of us are just taught like, oh, just put it in a box, bury it, pretend it didn't happen,
Yeah.
keep going because the next thing's coming. You've got to keep going. And we're addicted to this being perfect and productive. And it's not sustainable and it's not healthy.
Yeah. And it really, it's a story that doesn't serve any of us
Right.
because we're asking of people the impossible.
Mm.
And the whole, you should be done and through it and moving on and back functional is such a
What do you mean
harmful
after
story,
3 days you aren't ready to come back to
right?
work?
Like, it's so ridiculous. I said that to someone the other day who's in Australia, and she said, well, how long do people normally get off in North America? I said, 3 days is about the standard. He could not believe it. Anyway, different places, different rules, and the time that she got off was nowhere near enough either, but that's okay. So yeah, there's a number of things that I think are really critical for us if we want to shift this paradigm that's not serving any of us anymore. I don't think it ever did, but maybe in the 50s when we were all being the cleavers on the surface, it was fine. Well, we're not pretending to that level anymore, so we need to make a new normal, right? I love that you talked about different griefs for different losses. And I think something really magical there is that those losses that are not a loss of a person, first of all, need to be acknowledged as losses. And even if it's a change that's for good, like something really exciting is happening, anytime you're leaving something else behind or you're making a pivot, there is an aspect of loss, which, in those cases, it's a really quick process, right? Oh, yeah. Well, we go do a ritual as we leave our old house to go to the new exciting one or whatever it is. And so you can do small things and let those emotions flow. And that feels not so terrible. If we could be more conscious with those losses as a way to practice for the bigger ones,
Mm.
then when the bigger ones come, we have a little bit more confidence of our own ability to, survive, navigate, pivot, repurpose, all of the things that have to happen after a major loss. And it also, for supporters, gives us an opportunity to practice languaging. Like one of the things I hear the most from people is, what can I say? Like, what do I say? I don't even know what to say. Well, there's some things you can say. There's no one right thing. I wish I could make a bajillion dollars if I could find the one right thing, but there isn't one. The right thing is going to be different every time. It's always going to come from the heart. So, if you practice with someone with a smaller loss, what if you had a friend who's applying for a job that they're really excited about and they don't get it? What if instead of saying something, like we've all been trained to say something encouraging, right? Oh, don't worry about that. Like it just wasn't right for you. The better one is around the corner. Well, that denies their grief because they already have a whole
It,
story about what this job is going to mean, right? And now that's gone.
it
What if instead we said
invalidates.
something like, yeah, you're invalidating their emotional experience? What if instead we said something like, oh, we had talked enough that I know this job was really important to you and you had a whole vision of what this could mean for you. And now that's gone. And that's so disappointing. So, what if today we decide to be disappointed and sad or whatever feelings are coming up for you? And then tomorrow we're going to look at, well, where's that better job? Because I know there's a better job out there. but it's okay to be sad about it too. And
Yeah.
it's all the both and, right? That's where that emotional intelligence is so helpful. Because if you can hold that paradox, I remember saying to my daughter in the very earliest days, we are going to become masters at holding paradox because everything about grief is the both and. So we can be sad we didn't get the job and excited that, well, like there's something better for me, there's something more aligned, whatever it is. But it's that emotional intelligence level of being able to, first of all, get past what I call the mad, sad, glad trifecta. You need much more nuanced languaging than mad, sad, glad, which is where so many of us get stuck because we learned that in like kindergarten, right? Red, yellow, green is the elementary school rules, right? Well, it's a little more nuanced. We have shades and we have
Yeah.
blends, right? So really digging into that languaging, because if you can name it, there's a lot of comfort there. It
Mhm.
feels less out of control. It feels less unknown and scary. So that's a really big part of the emotional intelligence piece, right? Really getting to the nuanced emotions. You can have those conversations with yourself. You don't have to have them out loud. If you have one or two safe places to have them, that's even better. But you can have those conversations with yourself, right? To just be saying a few times in a row, like, what's the feeling? Oh, I feel mad. Oh, that's probably not it. What is it really? Oh, it's disappointment. Oh, it's frustration. Oh, it's, you know, whatever it is, there's many more nuanced ways to describe them. And that's really helpful in grief because you can make, we're sense making beings. That's what we like to do as humans. We want to make sense of things. And you're trying in grief to make sense of the nonsensical. So if
Hmm.
you can name it, that's really helpful.
I just want to
And
add to that because
yeah,
what I'm hearing is through this whole process, she's chosen to be conscious. She had to
mhm,
be conscious to be aware of how she was feeling so she could then name it and then allow herself to feel it and process it. So, this is the moment where we get an opportunity to allow things to flow to and through us instead of
yes,
locking them up in boxes, which now become triggers and blocks for later, where you then hire me to come and clear the trauma from your
that's
timeline
right.
in your unconscious mind. And what if you just decided you would process your emotions instead? So I have a mother who taught me the law of attraction young, taught me to focus on the positive. And in the beginning, what I realized is it was unhealthy
Hmm.
because there was no room for emotion or emotional intelligence. It was like, cool, got it. Now let's only be positive,
Yeah,
which is also the opposite of unhealthy, which means everything went into a box. And guess what? It's getting triggered later.
yeah,
So, what I'm hearing is grief, emotional intelligence, it requires being conscious, being aware, being present, and allowing yourself to feel. It's when we get stuck in the pity party for too long where we may need to phone a friend
yeah.
or see a therapist or what have you. And that's all great. And you might need assistance with it. And that's great. And that's also okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the big fears with grief is that if you allow those emotions to come, because especially in the very early acute days, they are unfathomably gigantic. It's the biggest tsunami you have ever been underwater, unable to breathe. It's all of that. And the same way to rise to the surface of the ocean when you have fallen and need to get to the top is to relax and let it happen. It's the same with the emotions. The more we kind of hold them at bay, we're like the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dam. It's not sustainable. And eventually that dam will explode. And that's what happens with all those emotions that we've put in little boxes, right? Either you hire someone brilliant because you realize at some point this is no longer healthy and I need to proactively deal with them, or they start to explode
Yeah. And
because they will not sit there benignly. It's not how it works, unfortunately.
it explodes when it's something else. It's somebody cut you off in traffic or someone cut you off in life. And
Yes.
then this is what we call the unwarranted response because
Yeah.
of the anchored negative emotion that was associated with a trauma that we chose not to process, which by the way is nobody's fault because I don't know
No,
any class or any school or any foundational education system that teaches you emotional intelligence. Maybe now they do, I'm not sure.
not really.
But yeah, not really. So just know that there's still much for us to learn and just bringing this conversation to the forefront so that people can start to even hear the word emotional intelligence. Maybe maybe that concept is totally new to you.
Yeah.
Because I know when I first learned it, I was like, what do you mean emotional intelligence? What does that mean? So maybe that's new for you guys too. And that's part of this grieving process, whether it's
Mhm.
the loss of a loved one, the loss of our old self, loss of an opportunity, and everything. We get to choose our perception of it. So we always like to say perceived loss, right? Um,
Mhm.
because we believe that everything is happening for a reason, and it doesn't mean it didn't trigger emotions that we need to process and feel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And interestingly, with grief, it's very patient and it will wait for you. So some loss will come along that allows you to grieve all of those griefs that you kept in little boxes. Isn't that fun, right? But it
Yeah.
is patient and it will wait. And if you haven't processed a whole bunch of it as best you can, and really, I absolutely believe that we are all doing the best we know how in any given moment.
Yeah.
And it's okay to look back and go, wow, I did not do that very well from this perspective. From that perspective, I thought I was nailing it, right? And you
Yeah.
were at the time. Great. We're all here on a growth journey. That's why we're on the planet.
Yeah.
But it is that sense, like it will wait and a new loss will bring all the old ones up. And sometimes, I had someone say the other day, I think they lost their job. I think it was their job. I don't think it was their business. I think it was their job. And they ended up in the depths of this deep, deep grief. And she couldn't figure out why until she connected that she hadn't fully grieved her father
Mm.
years ago. Like I was about 7 years before. So it took her some time to get there, but luckily she had that emotional intelligence piece enough to go, this response is not warranted to this activator. And so what did I miss, in the past that I now get an opportunity to unpack? And, but she was like, yeah, I was in this deep, deep grief over this thing that, yes, was big, but it was not like this big, and was able to make that connection. So grief will wait for you. So, and I knew that really well too, because I had had other losses, some that I had processed better than others. And I knew for this one, I could, there was no box big enough. There was no option to avoid. So it, as I said, it sounds sort of very lofty to be like, oh, I decided I needed to be conscious and curious. It sounds so like evolved. It really was a survival mechanism. Like I knew all my great skills at what's the problem, make a plan, solve the problem, carry on. None of that was going to work.
Mm.
So, if not that, then what became, okay, I have to be conscious. And the only way I'll survive being that conscious is to also be curious about, okay, then what? And then what? And how do I make sense of this? And what does this mean?
And it
So that's why they kind of went together for me.
and it's okay that that journey looks different for everybody, and it's that the
Absolutely.
length of it is different for everybody. So I know that when my grandfather passed away, we'll say suicide. We don't, I like to use usually a different word, but death by suicide. He's moved on. In that moment, I was the last person that spoke to him before he went to sleep. So there was a lot of different things that went through my
Yeah.
mind, and there's a lot of things that I had to process. And so, to be frank, I don't think I dealt with it exceptionally well at first and tried to put on just that positive face. And it took actually a couple of years of just allowing whatever needed to come up to come up. And so I just want to invite everybody to know that the journey is going to look different for you.
Hmm.
The length of it's going to be different. Um, and as you said, you can continue to move forward and still be grieving. And so
Absolutely.
that was a couple of year process for me, and I was able to move forward, and life moved forward, and everything continued to be good in my life, and I still was able to continue to process the grief. So I want us to start to see that it's also possible to keep moving forward, and by normalizing it and having this conversation and bringing it to the forefront, it will allow so many more people to be able to share that, because I
Hmm.
think what makes it hard is when we do it alone.
Yeah. And it can't be done alone. So, grief is one of those things that needs to be witnessed. You need people to help. You need people to just listen. And so you need to find those safe places, right? And the more that we can have these conversations, I think proactively too, makes a huge difference. And if we can have the conversations around the smaller losses. So, in my early stage as a grieving mother, grieving out loud, I am not a good first assignment. So if you have not practiced your emotional intelligence skills, if you have not practiced being messy and awkward and vulnerable and saying the wrong thing and apologizing and making amends and fixing, like if you're not practiced all that stuff, I am not a good first assignment, right? But what if we could practice it and build those connections with people and learn how that piece works in the lesser losses that still need to be grieved, they still need to be acknowledged. And then we've got some ability to language, we've got some ability to say something. It's never going to be perfect, and that's okay. Perfect is a myth. So we're just all going to move on from that. Right. But it's this ability to say something and know that you've done no harm. Because ultimately, that's the goal. How do I say something and do no harm?
Yeah. And how do you allow yourself just to be on
Yeah.
whatever emotional step of that ladder you're on?
Yeah.
Abraham Hicks calls it the emotional ladder. So we've got depression and down here, and you've got joy up here, and we aren't going to go from depression to joy. So just respect the journey. Next is anger, resentment, fear, and we work our way up to sadness, and then slowly to hope, and then happy, and then we get to joy. And so it's also just respecting that journey for yourself and not make yourself bad and wrong that you didn't go
Yeah.
from the lowest depths of despair all the way up. All we ask is every day you put one foot in front of the other, do your best, and your best is enough. And then grieving is an individual process, so it does need to
Hmm.
be done alone. You have to do it
Hmm.
in the way that it
Yeah.
works for you. And it's important that you don't stay by yourself. It's important to have that support system is so essential. So
Yeah.
reach out, create that safe space, create that support system, and just know that it's okay to feel your feelings, and your feelings
Yes. It's
are safe
actually
and valid.
mandatory. It's more than okay, right? It's mandatory.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I know that we could keep talking forever. And let's give a last piece of advice and let people know where they can hear more about you.
For me, the most important thing is that we are making choices all the time between fear and love. And if we could choose love more often, that would make a massive difference for ourselves and for each other. So that's my, if you can hear anything from here, it's that you just need to choose love. When you're operating from there, then, you will say an okay enough thing. And then if anything about this is intriguing to you, if you want to learn more, the best place to find me is on my website, which is alivedexperience.com. And I know it will be in the show notes, so you can click on it from there. And you can do two things there. You can sign up for the newsletter, which comes out at this point every second Friday. I promise not to bombard you with a million emails. And I share my latest blog and whatever ideas and suggestions I've learned or have come to the fore out of conversations I've had. And you can also book a time with me there. So if you want to have a conversation about how what I do might serve you or your community or your business or organization, that's the place to get on my calendar.
I love it. So, guys, that link is right there in the show notes. Make sure you check that out. It's time to live to your full expression, which also requires you to feel your feelings and own that emotional intelligence. And Suzanne is here to support you on that grieving journey of whatever that might look like for you. So, thank you so much for bringing this conversation to the forefront. Thank you for taking your lived experience and making other people's lives better because of it. And may you continue to own it and keep transforming life. So, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
My absolute pleasure. So, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the show. We'll see you back next time. And remember, stay happy, healthy, wealthy, expect magic and miracles. And what is the best that can happen? We'll see you next time. Thank you.